Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Experts of the Americas. I'm Wazamala, Fellow and Lead of the Caribbean Initiative here at the Atlantic Council's Asian Arts Latin America Center. I'm delighted to be here today in the Atlantic Council studio with Dr. Ashni Singh, Guyana's Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance. Minister Singh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Wasim. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Mr. Singh is currently serving in his third term as Minister of Finance and previously served in senior roles at the International Monetary Fund. He has served as the chair of Guyana Revenue Authority and received his PhD in accounting and finance from the University of Lancaster in the UK. Today, we're here with Minister Singh to discuss Guyana's unprecedented economic growth, challenges the country might face in the future, and how the government can work with local stakeholders and global policymakers to overcome them. Recently, the government announced that Guyana's economy has grown by almost 50% just in the first half of 2024, building on similar type growth in previous years. Impressively, the non oil sector specifically has grown by 12.6% as well. So, Minister Singh, you're here to talk about Guyana. This must be uh, many conversations you've been having over the past couple of years. And, the first question I want to ask you is, that was, I'm never not shocked to see the figures of Guyana's economic growth, not just this year but past years as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about why has that growth happened so significantly in the first half? Maybe even focusing yes on the oil and gas sector, but also on the non-oil economy as well.
I'm in fact really glad that you asked about that because you're right that the oil story is really so very well known and much less is known about what's happening in the non-oil economy. You correctly pointed out that we just reported real economic growth in the non-oil sectors of 12.6% in the first half of 2024. That was not a one-off occurrence. In fact, it reflects a sustained strong economic growth since 2021 um, to date. On average, the non-oil economy has grown by about 11% per annum. And underlying that is extremely strong growth across the entire spectrum of the non-oil economy. And if I can mention just a few sectors. Outside of oil, there's a very significant non-oil extractive sector. So Guyana is also rich in minerals. We have had we've had a strong dynamic bauxite industry for a very long time. And bauxite is showing very promising prospects with the bauxite companies looking at new product lines being introduced, including metallurgical grade of bauxite. And once we overcome the energy challenge, which we're currently investing in, we're going to graduate into producing alumina and other value-added products and value-added grades of bauxite. Guyana has also had a strong gold sector for a number of years. We have a number of companies, international companies, that are investing in large-scale mining projects that will see strong growth in the gold sector as well. Outside of extractives, we have and minerals, we have agriculture has always been a mainstay of the Guyanese non-oil economy. There was a time when traditional crops like rice and sugar were really the anchor of the agricultural sector. Today, we are diversifying into um, uh, corn and soybean and other crops, and also value-added agro-processing and agri-business enterprise is now a very big part of what's going on economically. And so agriculture has been performing extremely well. Tourism, Guyana has a vast pristine rainforest. We have incomparable flora and fauna. We are amongst the world's most attractive ecotourism destinations. That's been documented in the industry. And it's a very specialized niche, but it's a niche that really has remarkable growth prospects. And now with improved airlift and connectivity with Guyana, improved visibility enjoyed by Guyana in the global marketplace, um, and increased room capacity too. We have about 8 or 9 internationally branded hotels that are under construction and that will be opened over the course of the next 20 months or so. Tourism is showing remarkable promise and prospects as well, just to mention a few. And then, of course, across the entire spectrum of services, construction, logistics, and so on. So the non-oil economy is itself, very diversified, and we are working hard to improve the diversification and therefore the resilience of the non-oil economy. We're investing in addressing some of the historic um, impediments to improve competitiveness, like the cost of energy, improve connectivity with our neighbors, to improve trade, and so on. So we have a very strong non-oil base, which is growing rapidly itself, and which has extremely bright prospects going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. The two things that I take out of there, one is competitiveness, right? I think that's very important, especially in this type of global market, to have a competitive non-oil economy, and then resilience. It's resilient growth, right? So it's not growth that is, it is driven, of course, by oil and gas, but it's not tied, it's not dependent to it, especially on agriculture, services, etc. So I think that is important, right, for Guyana's growth, and it's something that I think not a lot of people, especially in Washington, are completely aware of. So that's Guyana's growth. I think two things that we want to touch on is, one is looking at the private sector in Guyana, and then looking about Guyana's ability to navigate some of the challenges that we're seeing at a global level. So first, can you talk a little bit about the importance of the private sector, but specifically, what are some of the tools and resources that the private sector in Guyana needs to go from just being not just a beneficiary of the economic growth you're talking about, but now a driver of future economic growth?
Absolutely. Well, let me say first of all that we do have an extremely dynamic private sector in Guyana, and the indigenous private sector, the Guyanese private sector, has been responding to, in a really admirable and remarkable way, to the opportunities that are being created. It is, for me, a source of phenomenal, immeasurable satisfaction to see how the Guyanese private sector has responded to the opportunities that we're creating, to the policy environment that we've created, the favorable macroeconomic environment, and the positive policy and conducive policy frameworks that we've put in place. The indigenous Guyanese private sector has responded really remarkably to those opportunities and to those circumstances. Given the rate of growth, the reality is that, and given the rate of growth and given the rapid emergence of new opportunities, including and in particular in the oil and gas sector, what you are seeing is a number of Guyanese companies entering or engaging in lines of activities that perhaps previously they might not have previously been engaged in. I would say that, notwithstanding the very, very admirable way in which they're responding, there are a number of things that there are a few things I would say that I would highlight. The first, of course, is that the reality is that a lot of what is happening is new to the Guyanese private sector, in terms of, if you think about issues like technology, research and development, prior industry experience, and so on. And so one of the things that we have done by law is enact a local content legal framework. That local content act incentivizes partnership between Guyanese companies and international companies, for the specific purpose of ensuring that Guyanese companies are able to participate in and contribute to and benefit from the opportunities in the oil and gas sector, but also leverage global industry-specific experience, for example. And so what we're seeing now is a number of Guyanese companies entering joint ventures and strategic partnerships. They might have the local knowledge, they might have local capital, they'll have local personnel, but they might not have perhaps some industry-specific access to technology, for example. And they're bringing in international partners and entering partnerships. That also sometimes addresses the constraints on capital, for example, and constraints on financing. So in some cases, it is advantageous to bring in international partners as a means, too, of mobilizing additional financing. And we've seen that. We've seen a number of Guyanese companies do that with remarkable success. And so the local content framework that we've put in place is one that still welcomes international participation, because we are proud of our status as an attractive place for international companies to do business, and we will continue always to maintain that. But we do also want to incentivize partnerships with Guyanese companies. Given the rate of growth too, I hear from the Guyanese private sector often too issues about access to financing. That, that is something that is actively engaging our attention through multiple channels, including encouraging partnerships because international partners will bring capital, encouraging reform and expansion in the domestic financial sector to make the domestic financial sector more efficient in its intermediation of resources and in the mobilization of financial resources for investment by the non-financial private sector in Guyana, and also encouraging the mobilization of international financing for the private sector. So, for example, we're working very closely with multilateral providers of financing for the private sector, like IDB Invest, like the IFC of the World Bank, like a number of the export credit agencies around the world who finance private sector projects, and also international banks who are increasingly looking at Guyana and looking at Guyana's private sector as an attractive place, counterparts to do business with.
Thank you, Minister. And I like the term you used, a dynamic private sector, and it sounds almost like a public-private partnership, right? It's a dynamic private sector that has ambition, but then it's a government policy that's helping to enable them and have access to some of these international tools, technologies, resources, etc. And I think that's incredibly impressive. Now, to wrap, would want to get your quick answer here on, we're seeing a lot of challenges happening at a global level, and despite Guyana's economic growth, like other smaller countries, there's a lot of import dependence, right? It's an open-facing economy, which means these global changes have an outsized effect sometimes. How is Guyana preparing itself to mitigate some of these challenges and also navigate these challenges as well?
Well, you're absolutely correct that notwithstanding rapid growth, etc., the reality is that we still really are fundamentally a small, open economy, and we are as vulnerable as any other open economy anywhere else in the world. And we don't face fewer external challenges than any other country anywhere else in the world. What makes the growth that we've achieved even more remarkable is that we've achieved it in the face of and despite the extremely challenging global environment in which we're operating. I'm not sure the time will permit us to address that fully, but I'll mention just a few. The reality is that, first of all, the challenges of climate change are very real for Guyana. The reality is that the majority of our population live on a low-lying coastal plain, which is also where the bulk of our productive activity is. And all it takes is one extreme climate episode, one extreme episode of additional rainfall or unusual levels of rainfall, combined with high tides because the coastal plain is low-lying, and flooding could literally devastate the Guyanese economy, as has happened on at least one occasion when in 2005 we had floods that destroyed and imposed a cost in excess of approximately 65% of the economy. And while that was one extreme instance, we face almost every year flood conditions that pose severe challenges to our productive sector. So the reality, climate change is a very real challenge for Guyana. We face what I describe as an extraordinary challenge to climate, an extraordinary threat from climate change, but we do also make an extraordinary contribution to the global fight against climate change, particularly through the contribution of our standing forests and our low carbon development strategy. But that's going to be a whole other conversation. I'm going to have to come back to do that one. Additionally, of course, like every other economy around the world, we have faced and we have borne the brunt of the vicissitudes of commodity prices. We've all lived in a world where oil prices have been as high as $146 a barrel and as low as less than $10 a barrel in recent memory. And while that might appear to be an extreme example, we have faced commodity price upheavals, whether it was the war in Ukraine and what that did for wheat prices, whether it is the supply chain disruption, the post-COVID supply chain disruption that resulted in container prices moving from, a container crossing the Pacific for the price of bringing a container across the Pacific moving from $2,000 to about $12,000 or more. Whether it is, challenges in the Suez and the Panama Canal and the impact that that has on supply chain and the cost of freight. We face these challenges just like everybody else. We face the challenges that are the public health challenges that everybody else has faced. We face the devastating consequences of COVID, and any other threat of pandemic or public health problems. And so the reality is that it is an extremely testing external environment in which we're operating. We're also facing, we're also facing the reality of, the challenges that are faced by many middle-income countries when per capita income rises, and the implications that that has for access to financing and so on. But here again, that's perhaps a whole other conversation. The reality is that the global, landscape against which or within which we're operating continues to be one that's characterized by a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risk, and that's the reality in which we're operating. We have in Guyana to continue to remain focused on our own domestic competitiveness, ramping up our production, improving productivity, continuing to grow our economy, continuing to create good quality jobs and equipping Guyanese people to take up those jobs, with a view to creating more income earning opportunities and improving the lives and circumstances of the Guyanese people, which remains our predominant concern in all that we do.
Well, Minister, thank you so much for that. And, a couple of highlights from here, that I think define the economic growth you talked about. Competitive growth, resilient growth, growth that is protected, a dynamic private sector, and managing risk is what I got from this conversation. I think is, I want to thank you so much for joining us here during your trip to Washington. And it's like you said, the figures of economic growth are astronomical. It's astounding. But what I'm taking from this is that it's not happening by accident. It is deliberate government policy and engagement with the private sector and international partners as well. So once again, I want to thank you for joining us and hope to have you here for round 2.
Thank you very much, Razim, and I'm looking forward to it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much.